Welcome back. Following Drayson, I've directed our attention to the remaining two notions of action-oriented perception. The ideas that perceptual systems or perceptual content are specifically connected to action. To understand these proposals, it's useful to start with the traditional view of perception and its relation to action. According to what Hilary Putnam calls the interface view, which will be familiar from Descartes onward, there are minds on the one hand and the world on the other hand, and perception and action sit at the interface between the mind and the world. The question then is, how is it that perception enables minds to connect with and act on the world? On the view that Susan Hurley calls the sandwich view, input from the world enters via perception, is processed by the rational mind, and then propagates back out into action in the world via the motor system. Rational thought, the stuff that Descartes and others think is so important, is the filling of the sandwich, insulated from the world by perception on one hand and motor systems on the other side. This classic picture was literally implemented in early robotic and artificial intelligence systems. On this view, perception collects information about the world from which the mind creates a representation of the world, for example, a map or a model, and then the mind uses that model to think, to plan an action, and finally sends instructions to the motor system to carry out the action. Perhaps the most famous illustration of this approach was the robot Shaky. In the videos I shared with you, Shaky looks pretty awesome, at least by 1972 standards. And Shaky is important, but keep in mind that Shaky was also quite limited in its capabilities. One notorious problem is that after the perceptual stage, when Shaky collects information about the environment, Shaky then stands still while that information is processed and a plan is formed. And with 1972 computing power, that can take a long time. If, during that time, the environment changes, then Shaky's plan will be a bad one, and it will run into things or fail at its objective. Shaky is nowhere near navigating through an irregular or active environment. In short, Shaky only succeeds in acting in the world because its environment is tightly constrained and relatively static. Now, as an engineering challenge, we might say that this defect can be solved by faster and faster computers, and certainly there's some truth to that, but we might also draw the conclusion that this sandwich model of perception and action is wrong in a more basic way. What's the alternative? Well, we could think of the content of perception as being already about what actions can be performed, or what actions are afforded by the environment in J.J. Gibson's terminology. On the Gibsonian or ecological view, what's perceived, the content of perception, does not represent the objective world in terms of lines and surfaces and edges. The purpose of perception is not to describe the world, but to act in it. So there's no reason to represent the world independently of how it's poised for action. We don't see shapes, we see opportunities for action. The Gibsonian or ecological framework is the main explanatory framework engaged by the researchers at the Center for Cognition, Action, and Perception at the University of Cincinnati. Their research program begins with the idea that what's directly available in perception, the content of perception, is information about what actions are available to the perceiver, so-called affordances. The idea is that the mind is not separated from the world, stuck between the sandwich of perception and action. So in contrast to Shaky, we don't have to collect information about the world and then calculate what to do. Instead, the activity of perception puts the agent directly in contact with the world and the possibilities for action the world provides. The world is perceived as already action-ready, and the world is also present, available to probe and respond to in real time. Of course, what actions are available to a perceiver depends on the physical characteristics of the perceiver, that is, on their body. What is step-onable for me is not step-onable for an ant, an infant, or a snake. And what is land-onable for a butterfly is not land-onable for me. The view that perception is action-oriented is closely connected to the idea that perception, and indeed cognition in general, is essentially connected to our bodies. Cognition is embodied, or as UC professor Tony Shimero puts it, radically embodied. A related idea is that the mechanisms of perception are themselves embodied, not just their content. One way to develop these ideas is to think that in terms of how it's actually implemented, the sandwich is open-faced. There's only one side. Here the idea is that there are not completely separate input and output systems, perceptual and motor systems. Instead, we can think of the motor system, the action system, as already engaged by perceptual input. One famous but controversial bit of evidence for this proposal is the discovery of the so-called mirror neuron system. Take a look at the Mirror Neuron video in this module. The important thing for us, philosophically, is that this conception of perception as having action-oriented mechanisms is another way of breaking down the sandwich view of the mind and the world. But Zoe Drayson argues in this paper that the motivations and evidence for thinking that perception is action-oriented because it has action including content are actually in tension with, and even incompatible with, the motivations and evidence for thinking that the mechanisms of perception are action-oriented. This is a problem because many philosophers and psychologists think these two things go well together and maybe even require one another. Drayson is surely right that many advocates of embodied and Gibsonian views of perception have argued that perception is action-oriented in all the ways that she discusses. So, if she's right in her critique, many people are wrong. What do you think? Is Zoe Drayson right? One way of thinking about the embodiment or action-orientedness of perception is to think once more about duplicates. If the advocates of embodied cognition are right, then a complete cognitive duplicate of me has to replicate not just my brain or the functional organization of my brain, but also my body. And some Gibsonians would argue that it has to duplicate not just my whole body, but also the relations between my body and the actual environment in which I'm embedded. I raised this kind of question previously using the example of Dodge Forthrast from Neal Stephenson's novel Fall, or Dodge in Hell. Remember, Dodge signed up to have himself cryogenically preserved, or whatever the most updated preservation technology turns out to be. So he ends up having his neural connectome scanned and uploaded to the cloud. In the novel, it turns out that people whose consciousness or self is preserved by only preserving their brain or connectome have different capabilities in the digital afterlife than those whose whole bodies or functional organization of whole bodies are recorded and reproduced. Those, like Dodge himself, who only had their connectomes replicated, have some godlike capacities in their new virtual afterlife and are less constrained by the purportedly spatial characteristics of their virtual world. On the other hand, they also lack certain capabilities and experiences that are had by those whose whole bodies were replicated. For example, in the novel, living people who want to be able to fly like angels in the virtual world after their deaths start to train during their lives to develop the neural and muscular habits that they'll need for flight when they're replicated with wings in the virtual afterlife. They practice acrobatics, trapeze, and even have cybernetic implants added to themselves during their lives. They can train their bodies in advance so that they'll be able to fly in the virtual world. On this picture, certain kinds of cognition and action are essentially connected to bodies, so that having or not having a body might enable or disable those kinds of thought and action. From that point of view, Descartes' disembodied thinker and Avicenna's flying man will seem to have relatively impoverished cognition and consciousness. What do you think? How important is embodiment after all?